Christmas morning, Cologne, West Germany, 1959. A synagogue on Runstrasse is covered in swastikas. The synagogue was recently rededicated and rebuilt to replace one that burned to the ground on Kristallnacht. Within days, there are copycat incidents across West Germany. Within weeks, 833 separate antisemitic attacks. Within months, similar incidents in 34 countries. In the United States alone, 637 incidents across 236 cities. The world draws an obvious conclusion. Nazism never died. West Germany, the country that just joined NATO, the country the West had staked its credibility on rehabilitating, is still infected. Newspapers reopen the question. Allies pull back. Diplomatic relationships stall, and Bonn is isolated. The world was wrong about what it was seeing. This wasn't a spontaneous revival of fascism. It was a Soviet intelligence operation, and it worked because the Soviets understood something fundamental. You don't need to invent fractures in a society. You just need to find the ones that are already there and detonate them. That operational logic has a name. The Soviets called it active measures. Offensive operations designed to shape the political environment of a target country from the inside. It's worth being precise about what distinguishes this from normal propaganda. Propaganda tells people what to believe. Active measures engineer reality. They manipulate events, institutions, and narratives so that a society moves in the direction you want without knowing why. The target does most of the work. To understand what that looks like in practice, let's go back to Cologne. To understand how this operation actually worked, you need to know one name: General Ivan Agayants. Agayants headed Department D of the KGB's first chief directorate. The D stood for the Russian word for disinformation. He was very good at his job. Before the Cologne operation went live, Agayants ran a pilot. He selected a village about 50 miles outside of Moscow and dispatched a team of KGB agents. One night, they painted swastikas on tombstones and wrote anti-Semitic slogans on walls. Then they left. KGB observers monitored public reaction. What they found confirmed the hypothesis. Most people were disturbed, but in some, the sight of Nazi symbols awakened something latent, and those people began committing anti-Semitic acts on their own, without any further prompting. The pilot worked. You didn't need to recruit hundreds of agents. You just needed to light the spark and let the cascade run itself. Now here's the strategic context that makes this more than a historical curiosity. This operation didn't come out of nowhere. It came directly after a Soviet failure. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. The Soviets had spent years trying to prevent it, working with far-right neutralists, running influence operations, everything they had. It didn't work. West Germany joined anyway. So the Soviets shifted objectives. If they couldn't keep West Germany out of the alliance, they would make West Germany toxic inside of it. And it worked, at least for a while. European partners pulled contracts. German diplomacy stalled. Newspapers in allied countries ran pieces questioning whether Bonn could really be trusted. That's the operational logic of active measures. You don't have to win. You just have to create enough doubt and disruption to degrade your adversary's ability to function. The Cologne operation is a near-perfect illustration of the active measures toolkit, not because it used every technique, but because the techniques it did use are the foundational ones. Exploit real fractures. Don't invent them. Latent anti-Semitism in post-war West Germany was real. Unresolved historical guilt was real. Allied anxiety about German rearmament was real. The KGB didn't manufacture any of that. They just applied pressure to existing fault lines. Plausible deniability. Because the cascade was driven by copycats, KGB involvement was essentially impossible to prove in real time. It took defectors years later to confirm what had actually happened. In the meantime, the damage was done. Pilot testing before operational deployment. The village experiment wasn't improvisation. It was doctrine. Active measures were operationalized and tested like any other intelligence capability. This is a professional apparatus, not an ad hoc agitation. Strategic patience. The goal of the swastika operation wasn't swastikas. It was NATO cohesion 6 months later. Active measures are designed to produce strategic effects over time, not tactical wins overnight. Freudian projection. The communist state, which was itself running former Nazi agents and exploiting far-right networks, accused the democratic state of fascism. This kind of inversion is a recurring signature of active measure operations. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The active measures doctrine didn't. The apparatus migrated into the GRU, into the SVR, into successor institutions that retrained the institutional knowledge and the operational playbook. What changed was the delivery mechanism. The Internet Research Agency's operations around the 2016 US election follow the same structural logic as the Cologne operation. Find real fractures in the target society, racial tension, economic anxiety, political polarization, and amplify them. Create content that looks organic. Let the cascade run itself. They didn't need to make Americans hate each other. Americans already did. They just needed to turn up the volume. The scale was different. The speed was different. But the operational logic, exploit real fractures, maintain deniability, aim for strategic disruption rather than tactical wins, is the same doctrine Agayants was running in 1959. This is not a new threat. It's an old threat with a new delivery mechanism. And understanding that distinction changes how you think about what's actually happening. Here's the problem with how we usually talk about this. The dominant frame for Russian influence operations, in the media, in policy circles, and public debate, is disinformation. And that frame implies a specific solution. Correct the false information and the threat is neutralized. But active measures aren't primarily about false information. They're about using true grievances as weapons. The racial tension the IRA amplified in 2016 was real. The economic anxiety was real. The distrust of institutions was real. Correcting a specific fake news story doesn't address any of that. The disinformation frame gives you the wrong solution because it diagnoses the wrong problem. Now, on the question of what actually happened in 2016 and what's been characterized as Russiagate, I'm going to stay neutral here because this is an area where the political stakes have badly contaminated the analytic conversation. What we can say at the doctrinal layer is the signature is consistent with active measures as a method. The intent to exploit existing polarization, the use of intermediaries, the deniability built into the architecture. These are the hallmarks. What remains genuinely contested, and what I encourage you to think about carefully, is the question of effect. Active measures are often more successful at creating the appearance of influence than actual influence. The ambiguity itself is part of the operation's value. If your adversary spends years consumed by internal debate about whether they were manipulated, and by whom, and to what extent, that's a strategic win regardless of what actually happened. The ambiguity is a feature, not a failure. This brings me to the hardest insight, the one that makes active measures genuinely difficult to defend against. The more open and high-trust your society, the more vulnerable you are. A free press can be manipulated through legitimate channels. Real journalists, real stories, real grievances. Freedom of assembly means your adversary can organize inside your borders without breaking any laws. Genuine political polarization means the fractures are already there waiting. Authoritarian systems are actually harder to run active measures against, not because authoritarian governments are smarter, but because they've already suppressed the open civic space that active measures exploit. So what does effective recognition actually require? It requires understanding the doctrine well enough to ask a different question when you see a fracture widening. Not just, is this true or false, but who benefits from this fracture widening right now? What strategic objective does increased confusion or distrust serve? Is the cascade running itself, or is something giving it a push? Those are intelligence analyst questions. They're not comfortable questions, and they don't fit neatly into political narratives on either side, which is probably why they rarely get asked publicly. Let me close where I started. The Ruhnstrasse synagogue in Cologne, rebuilt to replace one destroyed by actual Nazis, using the memory of real horror as a weapon. That's the operational genius of active measures. They don't require lies. They require history. They require real pain, real division, and real fear. And they require an adversary who doesn't understand the doctrine well enough to recognize the signature when they're inside of it. The swastika epidemic of 1959 eventually petered out. West Germany stayed in NATO. The operation was a tactical success, but the doctrine survived. It's still running. And the delivery mechanism has never been more efficient. Thank you for watching.